Making a classic sandwich loaf with einkorn flour and a sourdough starter isn't particularly hard, but your dough will have to be wetter, and that's what will give you a nice light loaf that bakes up really tall. And so there's some techniques that I use along the way to help me manage that dough, and I'm going to show you those today. I am going to measure all of my ingredients with a baking scale in grams so everything will be precise. Add 330 grams of einkorn flour, all-purpose, and a teaspoon and a quarter of sea salt. Mix them up together. Then in a separate bowl, combine a half a cup of warm milk and a quarter cup of water. If you can't eat dairy, you can just use all water. The recipe will come out just the same. The milk gives the bread a little bit of a more sweeter flavor and a softer crumb, but with all water it comes out great too. Mix in the sourdough leaven and combine that with your spatula. Add 2 tablespoons of sugar. I also make this at home without any sugar because my children don't really like sweet bread, and loaf turns out fine. So 2 tablespoons would be the maximum if you want a sweet sandwich loaf, and you can cut that down as to suit your tastes. Combine the wet ingredients with the flour. Then mix that up. All einkorn breads are basically no knead because the doughs need to be wetter than when you bake with regular flour. So you can just use a spatula or this einkorn kneading tool to mix the ingredients together. Once the flour is almost absorbed completely by the liquids, then you add the 2 tablespoons of butter. You can also use any other type of fat like olive oil or coconut oil or whatever you prefer. And you'll mix that up until the dough comes together, which will basically take you about 30 seconds. There's really no kneading on the counter. You don't want to put your hands on the dough at this point because the dough is really sticky and your hands will stick to it. But if you let this sit for about 15 minutes, the flour will have time to absorb the liquids and the butter, and then you can handle it and knead the dough. Now, cover the bowl with a plate or with plastic wrap and let that sit for 15 minutes. So now that your dough has rested, you're going to finish the mixing process with one turn. So dust your countertop lightly with flour. Use a bowl scraper to take out the dough, because einkorn needs a few minutes to absorb liquid. Dust your hands with a little bit of flour and then stretch your dough out into a rectangle. Then basically fold in each side. And then fold the dough in half. And that's it. Now you're going to put this back in your bowl, cover it tightly with plastic wrap, and let that rise for 3 to 5 hours. If you're working with a new starter, it might take longer than 3 to 5 hours to really rise up, at least 30%, and that's what you're looking for. So if you check on it and it hasn't really moved much, cover it up, let it rise for another 2 hours, and then check it again. So we're going to deflate this rise because we want it to rise up again in the oven, and we're going to shape it. Some people think that it's too wet or too sticky to shape, but it really isn't. I'm going to show you the technique that I use that's really easy. This is how I do it. Dust your countertop pretty generously with flour. Transfer the dough to it. Now this dough is going to seem like it's way too soft and wet to shape, but you really can shape. So basically you're going to use a stretch technique to get the dough a little smoother. So we'll stretch it on one side, and then we're going to stretch the other side. Stretch the dough in thirds. So we'll do that twice. and then we'll redust the countertop. Okay, now to shape the loaf, it's sort of a similar technique, but only a quarter of the dough will be stretched, and then you're going to tuck it inside and basically push that down to seal the seam. And when you push it, your hands might stick to the dough, so just have some flour handy. Then another quarter of the dough will get pushed down and tucked in. And then you'll do that again. And then one last time. So you have a nice tight surface. And you have to tuck in the last bit of it. Then you can just give it a couple of rolls to seal the bottom. And then if you have any of the seam open, then just seal it one more time with your hand. And then I use my bowl scraper to pick it up and transfer it to. Then I shake it around till it's perfect shape. It's okay if the edges are a little lower because it's going to rise up and correct itself in the oven. I don't usually recommend certain baking equipment, but we found in the Jovial test kitchen that this USA pan really bakes up the best sandwich loaves. I have been making these sandwich loaves for about 8 years, and if I bake them in another pan, they don't turn out as good. So I would recommend that if you don't have a good sandwich loaf pan, that you seek out this USA pan and try to get the 8.5 by 4.5. What I do is I buy 2 of them because a lot of times I'll bake 2 of these at the same time. And I like to cover the loaf like this because when the bread rises up, if you have plastic wrap, it can stick to it and then the surface will get torn and it won't look as good when it comes out of the oven. If you don't have 2 pans, that's not a problem. You can just butter plastic wrap and put it on the top, and the butter will prevent it from sticking. So you're going to let this rise for 60 to 90 minutes. You really want to see it rise, so you want to see it come up to about here. If it doesn't, after 90 minutes, let it sit out for another half an hour. Preheat the oven to 425, and then once you put the loaf in, lower the temperature to 375 and let that bake for 40 minutes. Let the bread cool in the pan on a wire rack for 15 minutes and then turn it out like that. So my bread cracked a little bit around the edge when it rose up, but that's pretty normal for einkorn because it has weak gluten. I actually baked this last night, so I let it cool overnight, so it's really easy to slice. If you slice into warm einkorn bread, it crumbles. So let it cool completely before you slice it. I've got nice rise. The slices are really moist and light. Everybody loves a great sandwich loaf because it's so flexible. You can make French toast, you can make sandwiches, toast. So I always bake this before I have company coming over, especially if my children have a sleepover. I think this is one of those recipes that you're really going to cherish for a long time.